Welcome to The Callover, a Queensland Law Society podcast that hopes to inspire a future of connected, capable and healthy lawyers. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we record this podcast, the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to the lawmen and lawwomen who for tens of thousands of years ensured the peace, order and good governance of this place long before it became known as Queensland. Welcome to this episode of The Callover. I'm Georgia Athanasiellis, and today I have the immense honour of speaking with the Honourable Michael Kirby, AC, CMG. Michael Kirby is a man who needs no introduction. He was called to the bar in 1967 and in 1975 became the youngest man to hold a federal judicial office when he was appointed as the Deputy President of the Australian Conciliation and Arbitration Commission. Later that year, he was also appointed as the inaugural chair of the Australian Law Reform Commission. In 1983, he was appointed as a judge of the Federal Court of Australia and in 1984 became the President of the New South Wales Court of Appeal. There he served until 1996 when he was appointed as a Justice of the High Court of Australia, a position he held until his retirement from the bench in 2009. In addition to his immense impact on Australia's jurisprudence, Michael Kirby's career has been marked by a commitment to human rights, law reform and social justice. On this episode of The Callover, we discuss his reflections on what has been a truly remarkable career and his hope for the future of the legal profession. Michael Kirby, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me back in the Law Society of Queensland.
Yes, well, it's our absolute pleasure. Now, I'd like to take you back to 1958 at the University of Sydney. Why did you decide to study law?
Well, that decision, as with most people, was made many years before, decades before. In fact, when I was in primary school, some fellows from the education department came and asked all these clever little kids, what do you intend to be when you grow up? And I wrote out, I intend to be a judge or a bishop. So one way or the other, I was determined to get into fancy dress.
Yeah.
I think after my high school, which was a high school in Sydney that has had judges for years, I really resolved that I wasn't the type of person who could cut up rats and bodies, and I wasn't as good in mathematics and subjects like that as I was in English and history. So I thought that's the career for me. That's what I'm destined to do, and I've never regretted it. I mean, the law and law degrees open out to so many opportunities in life, but for me, it put me on the golden path, and I've been happy with that career choice.
I've heard in other presentations you've given to law students that you've said it's important to be a joiner. What do you mean by that, and do you think that philosophy carries through from university into professional life?
Oh, definitely, yes. Well, I mean by that there are some people who spend their whole time with their profession or their family or their community group. But if you're going to really be engaged with what the essence of law is about, which is about justice, fairness, protection, help to people, you've got to understand their predicaments, and you've got to understand the injustices of our world. And that's more likely to be voiced in civil society organisations. And you've got oodles of them up here in Queensland. And similarly in New South Wales, there was the Council for Civil Liberties, for example. There was the International Commission of Jurists. There was student politics when I was at the university. So there are plenty of bodies that look after others who run into problems or are less fortunate, and that alerts you to the fact that the world is not a perfect place and that lawyers have a role to try to make it a bit less imperfect.
And you mentioned student politics there. You were quite prominent in the student politics.
I certainly was.
What made you interested in student politics?
Well, a lot of people who go on to high judicial posts took a lot of activity with student affairs when they were at university. For example, Sir Gerard Brennan, who was my good friend, he was president of the National Union of Students, and he and Jim Thomas, who later became a judge of the Supreme Court of Queensland, he was also very prominent in student affairs. So I went there and I loved it and I was good at it. And the secret was to always look carefully at the electoral statements of those who had offered for election, find what they're interested in, and then talk to them endlessly about their particular passions. And that really tends to get you ahead, and you get to understand what's brought them into student. What do they want to do? What are the things that give them a buzz? And so that's what I did in student politics. And I was president of the Law Student Society, president of the SRC, president of the union, and a life member of the National Union of University Students. So I did it all.
You're a very busy man at university.
I still am.
Yes. With that kind of grounding in student politics, what made you choose to follow a career in the law instead?
Well, I chose the career of law because that was what I had been preparing for. That's what I did my degree for. And I did think about a political life, but I was gay, and therefore at that stage, maybe even today, that was not a good look for political life. And therefore I thought, I'm not going to expose myself to that sort of attack. I'm just going to get on with my work as a lawyer, and that's what I did. But it would have been a natural life for me in some sense. But looking back on it, the opportunities that I've had to influence society and to influence it for good, I think, have been very many in my life in the legal profession and in the judiciary. So no regrets.
No.
Je ne regrette rien.
Beautiful. You were called to the bar in 1967. Can you share with me a couple of cases that had a real impact on you as an advocate?
Well, there were many cases because I had my day life, and I did a lot of work first of all in compensation cases, and later in trade union cases, and later still in some constitutional cases and important commercial cases. But that was not the area of my practice that I really enjoyed. That area related to the work of the Council for Civil Liberties and the work of student politics and of the students helping each other. And one case related to the liberation of Walgett. Now, Walgett's a little town in western New South Wales. You've probably never heard of it in Queensland.
No.
But it's a small town on the edge of the desert, and it had a principle that Aboriginal Australians were allowed to go downstairs but not upstairs. Downstairs was vinyl on the floor and lino on the floor, vinyl on the seats. Upstairs was gorgeous carpet and the grand staircase and velvet on the seats. And the manager would not allow Aboriginals to go upstairs. It seems amazing now looking back on it. But a group of students from the University of Sydney decided that they were going to liberate Walgett. And so they went up there, they bought the tickets, and then they grasped the hands of some Aboriginal young people, and they went up the grand staircase and they barged into the upstairs of the Walgett cinema. The manager came rushing out and said, "You know the rules here," he said, addressing the Indigenous patrons. you can't go upstairs. You can go downstairs. It's the same film. You'll have a perfect view of it. You'll be very welcome there. But the university students grabbed their hands and said, "Come, you come with us." And they went into the upstairs, and the manager caused a fuss. The police were called. The university students and the Indigenous student people were arrested, and they were prosecuted. And the Council for Civil Liberties decided to represent them, and they asked me to act in the matter, and I was then a young solicitor, and so I got one of the best silks in Sydney, Gordon Samuels, who later became the Governor of New South Wales and was my colleague in the Court of Appeal. He did it for nothing, and he had an excellent junior, and we didn't win the case, but the magistrate didn't impose a criminal conviction, which was important because some of them wanted to be lawyers, and one of them went on to become a judge. So that would not have been a good career move if they'd had a conviction. But the net result of it was that 2 weeks after that affray, Walgett Cinema dropped its policy. And that proves, first of all, that you've got to be courageous and you've got to take on things and you've got to fight them for justice. But also, sometimes you lose, but you win. And you've got to pursue the matter and not give up, never give up. That was Winston Churchill's motto, never give up. And I have that on a little piece of cardboard as I enter my room every day, never give up.
I like that. I think we all would do well to remember that throughout our career. In 1975, you were appointed as the inaugural chair of the Australian Law Reform Commission. What was the goal of or mandate of the ALRC?
Well, there had for some years been law reform commissions in the states, New South Wales and Queensland. Justice Bob Andrews, who later became my friend, was the chair of the Queensland Commission, and they hadn't established a federal body, and so that had been proposed but not acted upon. But the Federal Attorney-General was Lionel Murphy, who is a very unusual man, but a very creative and determined man. And he said, well, I want to create the Federal Commission, and I want you to be the chair. And I said, Lionel, I'm only 35. You need somebody who's old, wise. No, I don't want any of those old fuddy-duddies. I want you. And so ultimately I accepted, and I think it was a very interesting and creative period in my life, because we tackled a lot of problems, including some really difficult and new problems, such as the extent to which we should recognise First Nations law. How could that be reconciled with our legal system? And human tissue transplants, what the law on that subject should be, and how to handle complaints against the police, which was a very big issue in Australia at that time. So all of these topics we pursued, the reform of insurance, contracts law, and of sentencing principles. It was a very creative time. We had some terrific people, including from Queensland, one of whom was Sir Zelman Cowen. Sir Zelman was the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Queensland, and he was a very, very intelligent and informed lawyer, and he had given Boyer lectures for the ABC on the right to privacy, and the Liberal government gave us an investigation of the right to privacy, and Zelman was really knowledgeable about that. So we had terrific people. We worked very hard. We made a splash. We talked to the people of the nation on television and radio, and all of that was good for the work of the Commission. I came to the Law Society of Queensland many times at that stage to try to engage the Queensland legal profession.
And on that point about engaging with the profession and the community more broadly, you have never shied away from the media, it seems. That's not something all legal practitioners are comfortable with or pursue. Do you think it's important that the profession, or at least some people in the profession, do that?
It's important, but there are horses for courses. Some people are hopeless. People who never put a full stop in a sentence, they rave on and talk endlessly, and they're just not good communicators in that environment. But it is important for law reform, because you can't reform the law without consulting the people who are going to be bound by the law. And therefore, we thought it's going to be good if we consult, and it's also going to make it harder for the political branch to ignore what we do, and because it'll raise expectations, and that's what it did. And I think, looking back, that was a good step. It's true, it was unusual at the time, but it was necessary because of the nature of the tasks that were given to us, both by Labor governments and by the coalition governments. They were all tasks which were not just lawyers-only tasks. There were some of those. I suppose insurance contract law could be dealt with successfully by consulting the legal profession, but even there, to listen to the viewpoint of a person who has been disappointed in dealing with insurance companies can help you to get a grasp on the problem which needs to be addressed by law reform.
Perhaps if we can turn now to 1983, when you were appointed to the Federal Court of Australia and the following year became President of the New South Wales Court of Appeal. It's probably, though, your tenure on the High Court of Australia, which began in 1996, for which you're most renowned and celebrated. Are there any cases from your time on the High Court bench that are particularly memorable for you?
Well, there are many cases. In fact, people say, what is your favourite case? What was your greatest case? Students ask that, and I say, I love them all. When I was a child, my father, I had two brothers and a sister, and we would also know, who do you love most? And he always said, I love you all the same. And that's the attitude I have to my cases. You don't get into the High Court unless the case has a significant point or is interesting or important. So there were plenty that were interesting and important. Early in my career, soon after I was appointed to the High Court from the Court of Appeal in New South Wales, we had the Wick case, which was a case about Queensland and about the Wick people up in the north of Cape York. And it was the issue of whether the principle in the Mabo case, that you could recognise the Indigenous people's land title, was applicable in the case of pastoral leases. And that was argued in the High Court by a very skillful barrister, Walter Sofronoff, who later went on to become the President of the Court of Appeal of Queensland. And the High Court was divided 3-3, and I had just arrived. So I had the casting vote. And I decided that the Mabo principle was a principle of general application and applied to pastoral leases. And that was very important because Australia, unbeknownst to most citizens, is very substantially divided up into pastoral leases. And so it had very great economic significance. So that was a very important and interesting case. At the very end of my career in the High Court, my very last case was a case concerning the Northern Territory intervention. And the First Nations people challenged the constitutional validity of the Howard government's action with the Northern Territory intervention. The High Court again was divided, but I took the view that the Northern Territory was not was not subject to a lawful intervention because the Constitution of Australia says if the federal authorities move in to take over your property or acquire control of your property, they have to give you just terms. Now remember those words, just terms. In the American Constitution, there's a different phrase. We were copying them, but the phrase is just compensation. The federal legislation gave compensation, but it didn't consult the Indigenous people. And the official report, which had led to the intervention and the claims of sexual and other abuse and drunkenness and so on, that said, whatever you do, you must consult the people who are affected. And that wasn't done. So I said, yes, there's just compensation, but there's no just terms. Just terms after 150 or 200 years requires that we actually talk to the Indigenous people. And I was alone in my view about that. One of the judges of the High Court said that my comments were gratuitous, but I said they were not. They were absolutely central to the reason why I thought this was an invalid exercise of power. And more recent examinations of the intervention have shown that a lot of mistakes and wrongs were done, and I think that was because of the lack of consultation.
Well, and that probably leads to my next question, which is to quote you back to yourself, but you once said that judges of final courts have to think a little bit differently. They have to think about the long-term directions. They march to a different drum in a sense. What do you mean by that?
Well, I had a lot of experience, particularly in the Court of Appeal, which was a very happy time of my life, and that involved the determination of appeals, and I was under the control of the High Court because they had the last word, and you always had to keep in your mind that they might appeal if they disagreed with your decision in the Court of Appeal. But the High Court has no jurisdiction above it. The jurisdiction of the Privy Council, which was previously above the court, is no longer applicable. We don't go to London for the last word. The last word is in Canberra. And therefore you have to make sure that you're fulfilling not only the resolution of the legal arguments, but also the resolution of the policy arguments about the direction of the law. Is there a need to rethink this area of law? Is there a need to re-express it or tweak the principles of law, as was done in the Mabo case itself? That would not have happened if the High Court had just applied 150 years of previous land law. Sometimes the law needs change. Sir William Dean, a great judge of the High Court, whose place I took on the court, said, people say you've got to be careful about the floodgates being released. But sometimes when the land below is parched and dry, there's a need to lift the floodgates a little bit and make sure that you reconsider the law. And that is, in a sense, the fascination and the great interest of the law, that it's not a mechanical thing. We're not sailing on automatic pilot. We have a responsibility for the content, the moral content of the law, and especially in the final court, the court has a responsibility to check whether changing circumstances have meant that there's a need to re-express the law. That's what I did and what the other judges on much of the time did.
During your 13 years on the High Court of Australia, you earned the nickname the Great Dissenter. It's one thing to be sufficiently comfortable in your own skills, intellect and legal acumen once you've been appointed as a judge of the High Court, but it's quite another when you're just a young lawyer. What advice would you give to any lawyer out there who finds themselves in a difficult position of perhaps not agreeing with the a decision being made or with something they're seeing happening around them?
Well, when I was a young law student, there was a very famous judge in England, Lord Denning. And Lord Denning was called the great dissenter in England. And he said, when I came upon a problem and the law seemed to stand in the way, I would search the case books high and low, he said. I remember reading this when I was a law student, and search for a different approach that would be lawful, but which would have a better outcome. And so when I became a judge, and especially when I was in the Court of Appeal of New South Wales, which was contingently a final court, depending on whether special leave to appeal was given or refused to the High Court, that made me concentrate on what you can find in the principles of law and where you can find leeways of choice, new approaches to problems. So it's true, a young lawyer can't go around there saying, well, look, I'm just going to ignore what the High Court has said and I'm just don't pay any attention to the Court of Appeal or the trial judge. That is not how the system works. But just the same, an idea has to start somewhere. And usually in our system, the judges are so flat out just solving the cases and applying the law that even in the High Court, there isn't a great opportunity for creativity and for reconceptualization of the law. And how does that happen? It happens because a lawyer plants the idea in the mind of a judge. I mean, this is the challenge of our profession, that it is mostly fairly automatic, and applying the law and finding what it says and then giving it effect in the particular case. That can be done automatically. But there are cases which you come across in life where you have a chance to challenge what has been accepted, like the Walgett cinema or like the Mabo case. That had to start somewhere. And the Mabo case actually started in Papua New Guinea when a very able Melbourne lawyer, Ron Caston QC, went up to Papua New Guinea and with his wife, and his wife said, why do they recognise a native title up here but not in Australia? And that got him thinking, and that got him looking at the case books high and low, and that got him raising these issues that challenged the minds of Justice Dean and Justice Brennan and Justice Mason and Justice Gaudron. These are the stimuli to the legal system, and lawyers have to keep the creative element under check and control. But there are opportunities, and that's when we come into our own. That's where lawyers have to be joiners. They have to find the ideas in society, and they have to give them voice when they have the opportunity in courts of law and in the community generally.
And in an interview with the National Museum of Australia, I heard you say that you believe dissent, disagreement, controversy is the very essence of a democratic people. Do you think as a society we're losing the ability to have civil disagreements?
It's true, I think, that there are some people who get very impatient with the people who are of a different view. The very sharp differences in the recent United States election are an indication of how that happens. People end up hating each other instead of having rational discussion. But I think lawyers have an obligation to give leadership in this, because our whole lives, if you think about it, are taken up. If you're an advocate, if you're an advocate in court, whether a solicitor or a barrister, our lives are taken up with disagreement and with contest and dispute. And it has to be done in a way that resolves the problem and settles the controversy, but it can be done politely and courteously. I think I was a very courteous judge. I think I was a courteous judge because I grew up in a loving family where everybody was loving and polite to each other and engaged with each other. But some people are just angry, and they've got to get over it if they hold a public office and if they're performing high responsibilities, and just realise that sometimes you might be wrong in your approach. And that's what I kept asking myself. What if I am wrong about this? I was never very happy about that title, The Great Dissenter, because I sometimes thought that was used to disentitle my opinions from being given careful attention and consideration. So, and if you looked at the issues, the numbers of cases and the proportion of cases where I disagreed were not all that great, but it was lawyers are sometimes very conformist people. And what I'm saying is you've got to shake them every now and again and make them think freshly, because that's the history of our legal tradition, which we inherited from Britain. In the continent, in most countries of the world, judges are not allowed to dissent. They just have to say what the law is. The judge is, as the French say, la bouche de la loi, the mouth of the law. And they can't write a dissent. And many of them, when I've spoken to them, don't want to write a dissent. But the English always allowed their judges in multi-member courts to express their true opinion. And you can disagree with them and you can get agitated and jump up and down, but you have to respect the fact that these are uncorrupted officials who are saying what they truly believe to be the law applicable to the case.
And for that reason, we should jealously guard the right to dissent, I suppose.
Yes, and not only in courts and in cases and in lawyers' business, but in the whole of society. It's a sort of symbol to us of the fact that you can disagree, but you can do it politely and insistently, but not be labelled the great dissenter because you've disagreed sometimes. I think maybe the fact that I was gay and had seen the injustice of the law applicable to LGBT people when I was young, maybe that made me sensitive as similar disadvantages and injustices in the law made women more insensitive and Indigenous people more questioning. And so you don't want everybody to go around disagreeing, but in the highest court particularly and in courts of appeal, you need people to question, and that's been carefully safeguarded in the English legal tradition, judicial tradition, by the right to dissent and the duty to dissent if you disagree with the outcome and the reasoning.
Oh, and I think there is definitely something in that everyone's experience colours the way they interpret the law. And I understand it was in 1999 at the age of 60 where you announced Johan as your long-term partner. And after so many years of not sharing that part of your life publicly, what made you think that that was the right time to do it, and why did you think it was important?
Well, my partner, Johan van Vleuten, is from the Netherlands. So he didn't grow up in an Anglo-Saxon type of community. And he was forever going on about the fact that we should be more open about the issue of our sexuality. We had met decades earlier. We'd been together from the first time we met. We had a very loving and stable relationship. We shared everything with my family and with a lot of friends in society. When the AIDS pandemic came along in the 1980s, Johan took up voluntary work for the Ankali, which is a body of citizens, straight and gay, who helped people who were living with AIDS. So one day I came home from a hard day's work at the office, and he said, "How long do you think you're going to be in public life?" And I said, "Oh, well, my father's still alive and he's 95. And he said, "No, we've got to stand up." And this, I think, was a product of the Netherlands tradition. The Netherlands had abolished laws against gays in 1793 or something near that time, as they had in France. So he insisted, he banged the table, and ultimately we decided to do that. Actually, it was before 1996 or 1997. It was when the AIDS pandemic came along, we were much more open about it. And it wasn't a moment, it was a process. But ultimately I saw his point of view, and so we said this is ridiculous and people just got to get used to it and get over it and have an aspirin and a lie down and they'll feel better about it.
Yeah. We were talking about democratic principles before. One of them is everyone has a right to freedom of expression. That right includes the freedom to hold opinions and impart ideas without interference, including by public authorities. Do you think some of the proposed laws relating to misinformation and disinformation interfere with that right and impact our ability to engage in public debate?
Well, I haven't gone through with a fine-tooth comb those laws, so I don't know the details. But I think it's inevitable that laws of that kind, which are trying to tackle this new problem, new enlarged problem of misinformation, of false information, are bound to have some impact on people's right to express their own sincere opinions. But one judge in the United States said, you don't have a right of free expression. He was referring to the First Amendment in the US Constitution, to shout fire in a crowded cinema. And that is an illustration of the fact that words sometimes have consequences, and words lead to bad actions and to danger. And therefore, you can't have an absolute rule that you can say everything you like. For example, at school, if in a religious school, the teachers start to talk about LGBT students in a way that is reflective not of a scientific view about the small proportion of the population who are LGBT, but that this is God's curse and this is an abomination and you'll go to hell and all that. Well, that has consequences. People get very upset and very distressed, and it's really hard. And I know that from my own life. Not that I had that in a religious school, because my whole education was in public schools and they were secular. But there are people who want to force this down the throats of people who are in the minority, and that has consequences. We're now much more knowledgeable about the consequences of mental health, including in the legal profession, including the stressful life of judges and practitioners of law. So I think people should have the greatest possible freedom to express their opinions, and that should be very broad and it should be protected by the law and by the courts. But there are times when there has to be a qualification to that absolute rule. And that was said long ago in the United States, and in the case of a country that has a very strong constitutional protection of free expression, and in Australia we don't have that very strong constitutional protection, but we have a tradition and some protection, and that can't be absolute. So that's where lawyers will come in, because somebody has to resolve how far you can go or not go in protecting the right to free speech, but safeguarding against false facts and rumours and false untruths.
You mentioned that the law, while it can be incredibly fulfilling, can also be a stressful profession, and we are becoming more aware, I think, of mental health in the profession and protecting ourselves. What have you done over the course of your career to look after yourself?
I've always had a pretty calm approach to life, and I mentioned earlier that I lived in a family where we were all very close. There were 6 of us, my parents and 4 children, and we talked things through. I think one of the problems today may be that there isn't as much talking and everybody's texting, and it's all very impersonal, whereas we talk things through, and I think that's always been important in my life. And then at the grand old age of 29, my partner Johan came into my life, and that has been really a very good thing for me, because we talk issues through, and you can't have a long-term relationship unless you have a rule that where there is a really serious fight on, one has to give in. And that's what I tell people who are going to get married. You know the rules. The rules are you have to give in. And that's sometimes hard for lawyers. But in personal relationships, that's very important. So as for my own life and career, I was never greatly distressed by people criticising or even attacking me, because I knew that I was honestly trying to do my best in my tasks, and I had my partner at home who would always put me in my place if I was getting too big for my boots. And that is still the case. You know, I will go home tonight to Sydney, and Johan will be there, and we'll talk about the day and the week. And anybody who would want to deny LGBT people that blessing in life is not a kind people. I don't think they're really religious people, because the religions of the world, the great religions, all believe in love and outreach and helping and supporting others. And I've been really lucky in my life with my family, with my grandmother, with my teachers, my university teachers, with some of my colleagues in the law, and with my partner above all. And it's been, I've been lucky, but not everybody's as lucky as that.
No. No, I think that's, you've hit the nail on the head. If you've got those personal connections around you to support you, it makes everything else far easier to cope with. I'm mindful of the time, so perhaps the last few questions, I'd like to ask one about your appointment by the United Nations Human Rights Council to lead a commission of inquiry into human rights abuses in North Korea that occurred in May 2013. What's involved in an inquiry of that nature, and what were its findings?
There had for many years been much talk in UN circles and in the General Assembly about the horrible regime in North Korea. And eventually a decision was made by the Human Rights Council to establish a commission of inquiry. They'd had a special rapporteur, which is one level of investigation, but then there was a feeling this is really bizarre and it's got to have a more high-level investigation, and so they decided to establish a commission of inquiry. And so this body with 3 members, including one who had been the past Attorney General of Indonesia and another who had been closely involved in human rights in Serbia, 2 men and 1 woman, we were appointed, and we were appointed by the Human Rights Council without any dissent being expressed, which is most unusual for that step because it's a highly political step. Mm-hmm. And they contacted me and asked me if I would chair it. And I didn't have special knowledge about North Korea, but they said, you will have evidence given to you and you will have information and you will have to measure the evidence against the standards of the UN treaties. And so that was what we did. We conducted public hearings, which was unusual. We investigated. We talked to many refugees. We were not allowed to go into North Korea, and we never thought we would be, because their way of protecting themselves from criticism is to ban people going into their territory. But there was no difficulty getting evidence because they had, in South Korea, they had something like 30,000 refugees who had fled from North Korea and were only too willing and indeed anxious to come before us and tell us what terrible things had happened to them and their families in North Korea. So what was behind it? Behind it was the Charter of the United Nations and the commitment of the United Nations to universal human rights. There was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted by a committee under that great American Eleanor Roosevelt, and the principles of justice and decency, and we produced our report, and it created a sensation in the United Nations and many demands which are still there for action on North Korea. Mr. Trump tried to cozy up to Kim Jong-un, and it may be that he will take the same course again. I think talking to North Korea is entirely reasonable, but he's a dictator and a cruel member of a family that has ruled North Korea for 60 years. And the people of North Korea deserve better, and they deserve the United Nations principles of human rights. And our job was to explain what was happening and to try to promote action in the United Nations, in the Human Rights Council, in the General Assembly of the United Nations, and then ultimately, exceptionally, in the Security Council. So that's what we did, and I think we did a pretty good job.
You've done so much over the course of your career. We've only touched on a couple of the things today. What do you consider your greatest achievement?
I don't like to think of what my greatest achievement is. I know lawyers love to think in those terms. I think I've had many opportunities, and as in that wonderful film, Dead Poets Society, with Peter Weir, an Australian, telling the story of his English teacher, who taught him poetry at school. It's a wonderful movie, and at a certain point in the movie, the teacher jumps on the desk and tells the students a wonderful poem, an American poem, to try to encourage them to challenge the injustices that they see in the world, and I think that's been my endeavour, to stand on the desk sometimes, most of the time being very, very respectful and very respectable, but sometimes stirring things up. But the greatest achievement, if you like to say it, was not really in my professional life. It was finding a loving family to raise me, and wonderful parents and brothers and sister, and keeping those loving relationships even today. In a couple of nights, I'll be going for a wonderful dinner with my brothers and their partners, and that has been a great blessing. And having my partner, Johan, who's very Netherlands. I don't know if you know people from the Netherlands, but they are very difficult people. And they're always telling you as it is. They're in your face. And so everybody's got used to it. We've all become a sort of quasi-Netherlands family. We're now treating other Aussies in the same way, and they're all very shocked from time to time. But finding and keeping a partner for, in our case, 55 years still going strong is a wonderful achievement, and I'm quite proud of it. But I can't get too full of myself about it because I'll be pulled down and told, well, you've got a lot of lessons to learn, and you've got to be better, and there've got to be more holidays. That's what Johan is constantly telling me.
Oh, that's funny. Perhaps then a couple of final questions. What is your hope for the legal profession?
Well, my hope is that it will continue to be vigilant for universal human rights, and that it will learn more about the principles of universal human rights. We haven't tended to know these things in Australia because we haven't had a constitutional Bill of Rights and people aren't really taught about it. But I hope that getting copies of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at school. That's what happened to me. I got a copy from my teacher, Mr. Gorringe. He gave it to us, and he had been a soldier in the Second World War, and he said, unless you kids learn this and take it seriously, we'll just go on blowing each other up and killing each other. And so that, I think, is the alternative for our world, and it's a very dangerous alternative in the era of nuclear weapons and global pandemics and climate change and all the other problems that face humanity. So my hope for the legal profession is that we will serve that world and that we will serve it with knowledge about human rights, that we will develop a Human Rights Act for Australia. You have one in Queensland, but most parts of Australia don't, and they can be very good instruments for teaching children at school that you're living in a society with many people and you've got to have a basic principle of getting on with people and respecting them and not causing violence or upset. So there's plenty for the legal profession to do, continuing its service, but also extending its service into the area of universal human rights, which has been neglected in the past in Australia.
Let's hope we can fulfil that purpose. There's one final question that I ask every guest at the end of every episode, and it is this: what is one piece of advice you would give to your younger self as he commenced his legal career?
Well, if I look back, I think I would tell myself to be more courageous. I've been courageous on many occasions, and that's a good thing, but there have been times when I haven't been courageous enough. In 1997, an impediment had arisen in tackling the laws against LGBT people in Tasmania. And I knew two activists in Tasmania, Rodney Croom and Nicholas Turnan, and they telephoned me in my chambers in Sydney, and they said, we're thinking of taking Australia to the International Human Rights Committee to challenge the fact that Tasmanians' Parliament said that they would not change the law, the criminal law against gays. And we've got two questions for you. They said, will you send us some money to support us? And I said, sure, I'll send you some money. Not much, but I'll send you what I can afford. And secondly, do you advise us? Do you think we should take this to the Human Rights Committee? Now, I was then President of the Court of Appeal of New South Wales, but I was in New South Wales and there was no way that anything I decided there could influence the state of the law in Tasmania. But I said to them, no, don't do it. There's no way you will succeed before the United Nations. The United Nations is a timid political body. They've got to be very careful for those countries who hate gays, and therefore it's premature. It won't succeed. Don't do it. And they said, thank you very much, Justice Kirby. We thank you for your time and we'll look forward to your money. And subsequently, I learned that they went straight away, and by the procedure, the technology that was then available, fax, they sent a fax of their communication to the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations. The Human Rights Committee of the United Nations upheld their complaint. The principle that was then established that LGBT rights were part of universal human rights became a principle for every country in the world. And they were right and I was wrong. But the principle, I think, teaches that if there is a sort of inherent professional fault of lawyers, it's often that we are very cautious. And sometimes there are times for caution, but often there are times for courage and for action and determination. And you've got to know the difference between what was the time, and they were right and I was wrong. And I think the lesson is be courageous, be a joiner, get involved with your society, realise you can't change everything in the world, and many things don't need to be changed in a country like Australia. But there are things that need to be changed, and lawyers have an important role. Their profession gives them an important role in making change where it is possible through law, and lawyers should grasp those opportunities and do it in a lawful way, in a respectful way, in a quiet way. Don't frighten the horses too much, but don't be too timid.
I think that is a wonderful note on which to end this episode. Michael Kirby, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for everything you've done for the profession and Australia, and it's been a real honour to interview you today.
Thank you for that, and it's still going on.
Yes, of course. If you enjoyed listening to this episode of The Callover, hit subscribe and please share the link with your friends. And if there's any topic you'd like to hear us discuss or person you think should appear next on The Callover, please get in touch using the contact details in the show notes.